In the early hours of March 15, 1910, a sleek black limousine rolled past the remnants of what had once been the grandest home on Fifth Avenue, a mansion built by one of the richest men in America. Just over a decade before, the Vanderbilt family's sprawling estate stood as a beacon of wealth and power. Yet now, the house that had cost an astronomical sum to build was locked up, sold, and awaiting demolition. The once glittering Fifth Avenue, lined with palatial homes that stood as symbols of a rising Gilded Age, was now in the midst of a transformation that would tear apart the very foundation of New York's elite. But why? How did the richest families, like the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, and the Astors, walk away from their colossal fortunes and sprawling mansions? The answer lies not in war or financial collapse, but in the rise of a very different kind of wealth, one that would change the face of New York forever. The dream that demanded everything. In the late 19th century, Fifth Avenue was a street where dreams were not only built, they were measured in opulence beyond imagination. The year was 1875. New York City stood on the precipice of transformation. The Civil War had ended a decade earlier, leaving the nation scarred but hungry for reinvention. In the aftermath of conflict, a new class of Americans emerged. They were industrialists, railroad magnates, banking titans, men who had built empires from steel and coal, from tracks laid across wilderness and factories that devoured raw materials and spat out progress. These men needed homes that matched their ambitions. They needed monuments. Fifth Avenue, once a quiet residential street lined with modest brownstones, became the proving ground for America's new aristocracy. William Henry Vanderbilt, heir to his father's railroad fortune, understood this instinctively. In 1879, he purchased an entire city block between 51st and 52nd Streets. His vision was audacious. He would build not one mansion, but two, connected by a shared facade that stretched over 200 feet along the avenue. The cost was staggering, $3 million. To understand that figure, consider this. $3 million in 1880 would buy you roughly $90 million worth of property today. But Vanderbilt was not building an investment. He was building a legacy. The twin mansions rose from the earth like cathedrals of capitalism. Architects worked from drawings influenced by French chateaux, Italian palazzos, and English manor houses. Every detail mattered. Imported marble lined the grand staircases. Fireplaces were carved from single blocks of stone quarried in Europe. Ceilings soared 20 feet high, painted with frescoes that took Italian masters months to complete. The ballroom alone could hold 1,200 guests. William Henry Vanderbilt was not alone in his ambition. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who built a steel empire, purchased land on 91st Street. His mansion would be more modest in size, but equally refined in execution. John Jacob Astor IV continued his family's tradition of Fifth Avenue dominance, constructing the Astoria Hotel where his mansion once stood, then planning an even grander residence uptown. This was the era of conspicuous consumption. The term had not yet been coined, but the concept thrived. Every dinner party, every ball, every carefully orchestrated social event served a purpose. These mansions were not merely homes. They were weapons in a war for social supremacy. To own the grandest house meant you commanded respect, wielded influence, and secured your family's position for generations to come, or so they believed. The construction boom transformed Fifth Avenue into a construction site of dreams. Between 1880 and 1900, over 40 mansions were built along a 3-mile stretch of the avenue. Each one tried to outdo the last. More rooms, taller ceilings, rarer materials. The Gilded Age had arrived, and it wore its wealth like armor. But beneath the marble and gold leaf, a question lurked. How long could this dream sustain itself? What would it cost to maintain these monuments, not just for a year, but for a lifetime, for a generation? The families building these palaces did not ask such questions. They were men of action, not reflection. They believed in permanence. They believed in legacy. They believed that wealth, once accumulated, could be preserved forever. They were wrong. The race to build the crown jewel. With every mansion built, the stakes of prestige grew higher, and Fifth Avenue became a battlefield for the richest families in the world. Cornelius Vanderbilt II watched his Uncle William's twin mansions from his own more modest home downtown. The sight gnawed at him. As the grandson of the Commodore, the original Vanderbilt who built the family fortune, Cornelius believed he deserved the family's greatest architectural triumph. In 1889, he made his move. He purchased the entire block front on Fifth Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets. The lot alone cost $600,000. But Cornelius was not thinking small. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's first trained architect from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Together, they planned something unprecedented. The mansion would be modeled after the Château de Blois in France's Loire Valley. It would contain 137 rooms spread across 5 floors. The exterior would be clad in Indiana limestone, carved with intricate details that required artisans to work for 3 years straight. Inside, a grand staircase made of Cayenne stone would rise 3 stories, lit by a skylight of stained glass. The total cost reached $3,500,000. Construction required over 600 workers, stone carvers, plasterers, gilders, electricians. Installing the newest technology, the house consumed materials like a hungry beast. 60 railcar loads of marble, thousands of square feet of hand-painted wallpaper from France, chandeliers weighing half a ton each, shipped from Venice in custom crates. Hunt designed every room as a showpiece. The dining room seated 200 guests beneath a ceiling, painted to resemble a twilight sky. The library held 20,000 volumes, its walls paneled in Santo Domingo mahogany that had taken 40 years to cure. The master bedroom suite occupied an entire wing, complete with private sitting rooms, dressing chambers, and bathrooms fitted with silver fixtures. But Cornelius Vanderbilt was not the only one building. The competition intensified. Henry Clay Frick, the coke and steel magnate, purchased land on 70th Street in 1913. His mansion would be designed as a museum from the start, intended to outlive him and house his art collection for public enjoyment. The construction took 2 years. The cost exceeded $5 million. Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steel, outdid them all. His mansion on Riverside Drive contained 75 rooms, a pool lined with marble, a bowling alley, and a power plant in the basement, capable of generating electricity for a small town. The price tag approached $7 million. These numbers tell a story of escalation. Each new mansion had to surpass the last, not just in size, but in craftsmanship, in imported materials, in technological innovation. Electric lighting replaced gas. Central heating systems pumped steam through pipes hidden in walls. Elevators carried residents between floors. Telephone systems connected rooms. These were not merely homes. They were showcases of American industrial might. built by the very men who drove that industrial revolution. The architects became celebrities in their own right. Richard Morris Hunt, Stanford White, Carrere, and Hastings. Their names appeared in society columns alongside their clients. They traveled to Europe, studying palaces and chateaux, then adapted those designs for New York's climate and American tastes. The result was an architectural hybrid, European grandeur filtered through American ambition. The construction process itself became a spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch marble columns hoisted into place by steam cranes. Newspapers published progress reports. Society pages speculated about interior details, guest lists for opening balls, the value of art collections that would fill the walls. And the families who commissioned these palaces believed they were building forever. They envisioned generations of Vanderbilts, Astors, Carnegies, and Fricks walking these halls, hosting the nation's elite, shaping American culture from their Fifth Avenue thrones. But architecture, no matter how grand, cannot escape the forces of economics. And the very capitalism that built these fortunes was already preparing to devour them. The question no one asked in those heady days of construction was simple but devastating. What happens when the cost of maintaining a dream exceeds its value? The height of glory. By the turn of the century, Fifth Avenue had reached its zenith, but the dream was already beginning to fray at the edges. The year 1900 marked a pinnacle. From Washington Square to Central Park, Fifth Avenue glittered with mansions that represented a combined wealth of over $500 million. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $15 billion in today's money, concentrated along a single 3-mile stretch of street. The social season ran from November through March. During those months, Fifth Avenue came alive each evening. Carriages lined the curbs, horses stamping in the cold, footmen in livery waiting by doors. Inside the mansions, gas lights gave way to the new electric bulbs, casting a warmer glow over rooms filled with New York's 400 most important families. That number was not arbitrary. It was the capacity of Mrs. Caroline Astor's ballroom, and therefore the precise count of people who mattered in New York society. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 set the standard for excess. Alva Vanderbilt, married to William Kissam Vanderbilt, orchestrated an event that cost $250,000. Guests arrived in costumes that cost thousands to create. The mansion was transformed into a palace from a fairy tale. Orchids imported from South America filled every room. A full orchestra played until dawn. Champagne flowed without restraint. But the parties masked a growing problem. These mansions were not just expensive to build. They were ruinously expensive to maintain. Consider the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. The house employed a staff of 40, a butler, under butler, footmen, ladies' maids, chambermaids, cooks, kitchen staff, laundresses, a head housekeeper to manage them all. Each employee required wages, uniforms, housing, and meals. The annual payroll exceeded $50,000. Then came the operational costs. Heating a 137-room mansion through a New York winter consumed tons of coal. The bills ran to $30,000 annually. Electric lighting, still a novelty, cost another $15,000. Maintenance and repairs added $20,000 more. Property taxes claimed another $40,000. Insurance premiums protected against fire and theft. Add it all together, and the Vanderbilt mansion cost roughly $200,000 per year just to keep the doors open. That was before entertaining, before buying new furniture to replace what wore out, before renovations to keep up with changing fashions. $200,000 in 1900 equals about $7 million today, every single year, forever, and the mansions generated no income. They were purely consumptive. A coal mine produces coal. A railroad carries freight and passengers. A factory manufactures goods. But a Fifth Avenue mansion simply consumed resources, demanding more and more capital to maintain the illusion of permanence. The families could afford it, of course, for a time. But wealth is never static. It grows or it shrinks. And the second generation rarely possesses the same hunger, the same ruthlessness that built the fortune in the first place. Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899. His son, Neely, inherited the Fifth Avenue mansion along with a portion of the family fortune. But Neely had been disinherited from the bulk of the estate after marrying against his parents' wishes. The mansion became a burden he could barely afford. He hosted fewer parties, closed entire wings, let staff go. The same pattern repeated across Fifth Avenue. The men who built these mansions were dying. Their children inherited not just wealth, but expectations. They were expected to maintain the houses, host the parties, uphold the family name. But many lacked the business acumen or interest in the industries that funded this lifestyle. They were heirs, not builders. Meanwhile, New York itself was changing. The city that had nurtured these fortunes was transforming into something new, something faster, something that had no patience for old money or old ways. From the windows of their mansions, Fifth Avenue's residents could see the future rising. Office buildings climbed higher each year. The first skyscrapers appeared downtown, steel frames allowing structures to reach 20, 30, 40 stories. The Flatiron Building, completed in 1902, stood 22 stories tall and became an instant landmark. The Singer Building followed in 1908, reaching 47 stories. These towers represented a new kind of wealth. Not inherited fortunes, but commercial empires. Not family dynasties, but corporations. And they needed space. They needed land. They needed, increasingly, Fifth Avenue. The residents of the great mansions watched this transformation with a mix of fascination and dread. Their world was ending. They knew it, even if they could not yet admit it. The Gilded Age, which had seemed eternal in its excess, was collapsing under its own weight. But the end would not come suddenly. It would come through 1,000 small defeats, each one eroding the foundation until nothing remained but memories and photographs of a world that once seemed permanent. The true crisis was just beginning, when the numbers stopped making sense. For all the splendor, the bottom line could no longer justify the extravagant upkeep of Fifth Avenue's grand mansions. The mathematics of mansion ownership became impossible to ignore after World War I. The war changed everything, even for those who never set foot on a battlefield. Inflation ravaged the dollar. The cost of labor doubled. Materials that once flowed cheaply from Europe dried up as nations rebuilt their own shattered cities. A Fifth Avenue mansion that cost $200,000 annually to maintain in 1900 now demanded $400,000 or more by 1920. But fortunes did not double along with costs. In fact, many shrank. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 changed the rules of wealth accumulation. Before the tax, a man could earn millions and keep millions. After, the government claimed progressively larger shares. By 1918, the top marginal rate reached 77%. A Vanderbilt or Carnegie, making $1 million in income, now sent $770,000 to Washington. The Vanderbilt family offers the clearest case study in financial erosion. Cornelius Vanderbilt I, the Commodore, died in 1877 with a fortune of $100 million. His son William Henry doubled it to $200 million by 1885. But then came the Great Dispersal. William Henry's will divided the fortune among his 8 children. Each received roughly $25 million. Large sums, certainly, but no longer dynasty-building wealth. Those children married and had children of their own. The fortune subdivided again. By the 3rd generation, a typical Vanderbilt heir might receive $5 million. Still substantial, but now compare that to the costs. The Fifth Avenue mansion required $400,000 per year. The summer cottage in Newport needed another $200,000. The hunting lodge in the Adirondacks cost $100,000. Staff, horses, yachts, travel, entertaining. The bills mounted relentlessly. A $5 million inheritance invested wisely might generate $250,000 in annual income, assuming a 5% return. But that income could not cover the costs of maintaining even one mansion, let alone 3 or 4 properties spread across multiple states. The mathematics simply failed. Every year, the principal had to be invaded. Every year, the fortune shrank a little more. And this assumed wise investment. Many Vanderbilt heirs proved spectacularly bad at managing money. Reginald Claypool. Vanderbilt inherited $7 million in 1914. He spent it all by 1925, dying at age 45 with debts exceeding his assets. His daughter Gloria would grow up in relative poverty, fighting legal battles for scraps of the family fortune. The other families faced similar pressures. Henry Clay Frick died in 1919, leaving his mansion to become a museum because his children could not afford to maintain it as a residence. Andrew Carnegie gave away 90% of his fortune before his death in 1919, recognizing that concentrated wealth led to concentrated problems. The Astor family, once worth $400 million in real estate, saw that fortune fragment across dozens of heirs, each claiming their share but none commanding the resources to maintain the grand Fifth Avenue properties. The property taxes alone became crushing. New York City, growing rapidly, needed revenue to build subways, pave roads, construct bridges. The city assessor looked at Fifth Avenue's mansions and saw untapped potential. Tax assessments climbed steadily. A mansion assessed at $2 million in 1900 might be valued at $5 million by 1920. Even at a 2% rate, that meant $100,000 in annual taxes. The rate itself climbed as the city's needs grew. By 1925, some mansions faced tax bills exceeding $200,000 per year. These numbers compounded. High taxes plus high maintenance plus high staffing costs created an economic vice that tightened annually. And unlike previous generations, who could always earn more through aggressive business practices, the heirs of the Gilded Age industrialists often lacked both the skill and the stomach for the cutthroat capitalism that built the fortunes. They were trapped. Selling the mansion meant admitting defeat, abandoning the family legacy, proving themselves unworthy of the inheritance. But keeping the mansion meant hemorrhaging capital year after year until bankruptcy loomed. Pride demanded they stay. Economics demanded they leave. The servants noticed first. Paychecks arrived late. Staffing levels dropped. The butler who once commanded a team of 20 now supervised 10. Entire floors of mansions remained closed, dust sheets covering furniture. Windows shuttered against the light. The great ballrooms fell silent. The orchestras stopped coming. The champagne stopped flowing. By 1925, the crisis reached a tipping point. The families could no longer pretend the situation was temporary. The numbers had stopped making sense years earlier. Now they had stopped making any sense at all. Something had to give. And Fifth Avenue itself was about to provide the final, decisive blow. The changing tides of New York. As New York evolved, so did the demands of the city, and the upper class's once untouchable homes suddenly became liabilities. The transformation began with zoning. In 1916, New York City passed the nation's first comprehensive zoning law. The legislation seems technical, almost boring, until you understand its implications. The law divided the city into districts: residential, commercial, and unrestricted. It regulated building heights, setbacks, and uses. And crucially, it did not protect Fifth Avenue's residential character. The avenue from Washington Square to 59th Street was designated for commercial use. Above 59th, the rules were less clear. Developers could petition for variances. They could argue that commercial use served the public interest. They could essentially transform a residential block into an office district with enough legal maneuvering. The residents of Fifth Avenue's mansions fought back. They formed preservation committees. They hired lawyers. They lobbied city officials. But their arguments rang hollow. How could they claim Fifth Avenue should remain residential when they themselves were abandoning their homes? How could they argue for preservation when they were selling to developers? Because that was exactly what was happening. The first crack in the facade appeared in 1906, when Benjamin Altman opened his department store on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. Altman was himself a member of New York's elite. He knew the rules. He knew Fifth Avenue was residential, but he also knew that commerce was coming, and he wanted to be first. His store was designed to look like a palazzo, softening the commercial intrusion, but it was still a store, and it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Customers flooded in. Revenue soared. Other retailers watched and learned. By 1920, the transformation accelerated. Saks Fifth Avenue opened at 50th Street in 1924. Best and Company followed. Lord & Taylor moved from its original location. Each new store claimed another block. Each one drove property values higher, but higher values meant higher taxes, which meant more pressure on the mansion owners to sell. The economics became brutal. A property owner paying $200,000 in taxes on a mansion could sell that same property to a developer for $5 million. The developer would tear down the mansion, build a 10-story retail building, and lease space to stores for annual rents totaling $1 million. After taxes and costs, the developer might clear $300,000 per year in profit. The numbers made perfect sense for everyone, except the family trying to live in the mansion. Developers circled like sharks. They made offers, generous offers, then increasingly aggressive offers. They promised to preserve architectural details, to honor the family name, to ensure a dignified transition. These were lies, of course. The moment the sale closed, the wrecking crews arrived. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion sold in 1926. The sale price was $7 million, which sounds impressive until you remember the house cost $3.5 million to build in 1889. Adjusted for inflation, the family sold at a substantial loss. But they had no choice. The annual costs had become unsustainable. The mansion was demolished within 6 months. A commercial building replaced it. The Astor Mansion at 34th Street went next. Then the William Waldorf Astor property. Then the Huntington Mansion. Then one by one, the great houses fell to the wrecking ball. Each demolition took weeks. The walls were thick, the materials valuable. Salvage crews picked through the rubble, selling marble fireplaces to antique dealers, stained glass to collectors, carved wood paneling to anyone who would buy it. The sound of destruction became familiar on Fifth Avenue. The crash of stone, the shriek of metal being torn apart, the clouds of dust that settled over everything. Residents who remained in their mansions woke to these sounds. They watched from their windows as neighbors disappeared, replaced by construction sites, then by gleaming new buildings that seemed to mock the old order. But the transformation was not just commercial. Fifth Avenue was also changing socially. The automobile replaced the carriage. The streets, once quiet except for the clip-clop of horses, now roared with traffic. Trucks delivered goods to the new stores. Taxis ferried customers. Buses carried commuters. The peaceful residential character that made Fifth Avenue desirable in the first place had vanished. Noise ordinances meant nothing. Pollution from exhaust pipes fouled the air. The new buildings blocked sunlight, casting the remaining mansions in permanent shadow. The neighborhoods that once seemed exclusive now felt crowded, chaotic, invaded. The social fabric tore as well. The old families moved away. Some went to Park Avenue, where new luxury apartment buildings offered modern amenities without the crushing costs of a private mansion. Others moved to the suburbs, to Greenwich and Westchester, where they could maintain large properties without fighting the city's relentless commercial pressure. A few moved abroad, to Paris or London, where old money still commanded respect. Those who stayed became anachronisms. They hosted smaller parties for dwindling guest lists. They watched as their children rejected the old ways, preferring apartment living to mansion maintenance. They aged in houses that aged faster, surrounded by reminders of a world that no longer existed. The city offered no sympathy. New York was remaking itself as the commercial capital of the world. It needed office space, retail space, hotel space. It needed to move forward, not preserve the past. The mansions represented an inefficient use of incredibly valuable land. From a purely economic perspective, they had to go, and so they went. By 1930, fewer than 20 of the original 40 great mansions remained. By 1940, fewer than 10. Today, only a handful survive, most converted to institutional uses or museums. The era of Fifth Avenue as a residential paradise for the ultra-wealthy lasted barely 50 years. Built with such confidence, demolished with such efficiency. The families who abandoned Fifth Avenue did not do so willingly. They did so because the alternative was financial ruin. The city changed beneath their feet, and they could not stop it. The very forces of capitalism that built their fortunes now destroyed their homes. It was progress. It was inevitable. It was tragedy. The fall of the Titans. By the 1920s, the unthinkable happened. New York's elite were no longer kings of Fifth Avenue, but exiles from their own streets. The Vanderbilt dynasty offers the most dramatic collapse. At the family's peak in the 1890s, they owned 10 major properties along Fifth Avenue. By 1940, they owned 0. Not a single Vanderbilt residence remained on the street their family had dominated for half a century. The reasons cascaded like dominoes. First came the income tax, claiming up to 77% of earnings. Then the estate tax, taking 40% of inherited wealth. Then the maintenance costs, doubling and tripling as labor demanded higher wages and materials grew scarce. Then the property taxes, climbing as the city reassessed land values based on commercial potential rather than residential use. Each individual pressure might have been survivable. Together, they created a perfect storm of financial destruction. Gloria Vanderbilt, born in 1924, inherited a trust fund worth $4 million from her father Reginald. It sounds like wealth, but by the time lawyers finished fighting over the estate, by the time taxes claimed their share, by the time trustees extracted their fees, Gloria received roughly $1.5 million. At age 10, she became the most famous poor little rich girl in America. The irony was not lost on journalists, who wrote extensively about the Vanderbilt fall from grace. But Gloria was not alone. The entire third and fourth generations of Vanderbilts faced similar fates. They attended the right schools, married within the right circles, and found themselves increasingly unable to maintain the lifestyle their grandparents had pioneered. The mansions sold, the art collections dispersed. The family name remained famous, but the fortune that gave it power evaporated. Carnegie's legacy followed a different path but arrived at the same destination. Andrew Carnegie spent the last years of his life giving away his fortune, endowing libraries, funding universities, establishing foundations. He believed that to die rich was to die disgraced. His mansion on 91st Street passed to his widow, who lived there until 1946. When she died, the house was demolished immediately. Carnegie's daughter had no interest in maintaining it. The cost would have consumed her inheritance within a decade. The Astor family fragmented spectacularly. Vincent Astor inherited the bulk of the family fortune in 1912, when his father died on the Titanic. Vincent was 20. He inherited roughly $87 million, making him one of the richest young men in America. But he also inherited dozens of aging properties, including multiple Fifth Avenue mansions that demanded constant investment to maintain. Vincent sold aggressively. He demolished his father's mansion and built the Astor Hotel. He sold land to developers. He converted residential properties to commercial use. He recognized what others denied. The age of the great Fifth Avenue mansion was over. By liquidating quickly, he preserved some wealth. Those who held on lost everything. The Frick mansion survived only because Henry Clay Frick's will specified it must become a museum. His children fought the provision, arguing they should inherit the property. The courts ruled against them. Today, the Frick collection stands as one of the few intact Fifth Avenue mansions, preserved precisely because it was taken out of private hands. The human cost of this collapse extended beyond finances. These families had built their entire identities around their Fifth Avenue addresses. To be a Vanderbilt of Fifth Avenue meant something. It granted social access, political influence, and cultural authority. Losing the mansion meant losing that identity. Depression, alcoholism, and suicide plagued the Gilded Age families as their fortunes declined. Cornelius Vanderbilt III committed suicide in 1942. He had watched his family's empire crumble and could not bear it. Others simply withdrew from public life, embarrassed by their reduced circumstances, unable to compete in the new social order. The servants faced their own tragedy. A butler who had spent 30 years serving the Vanderbilts found himself unemployed at age 60 when the mansion closed. His skills were specialized, his references worthless in a world that no longer employed private staff on such scale. Maids, footmen, cooks, they all faced the same fate. Thousands lost their jobs as the mansions closed. Some found work in the new luxury apartments, but the positions paid less and offered less prestige. Many simply left domestic service entirely. The demolition crews worked with ruthless efficiency. They gutted interiors first, selling anything of value. Marble fireplaces went to salvage dealers, crystal chandeliers to antique shops, carved wood paneling to anyone willing to pay. What couldn't be sold was smashed and hauled away. Then came the structural demolition. Steel balls swung through walls. Dynamite brought down stone facades. Dump trucks carried the rubble to fill sites around the city. A mansion that took 3 years to build could be destroyed in 3 weeks. The speed was intentional. Developers wanted the land cleared quickly. Every day of delay cost money. The demolition contracts specified tight deadlines. The crews worked around the clock, 7 days a week, until nothing remained but a bare lot ready for new construction. Neighbors watched in horror. Each demolition confirmed their own fate. If the Vanderbilt mansion could fall, if the Astor estate could be erased, then no property was safe. The psychological impact was devastating. These families had believed in permanence. They had built monuments designed to last centuries. To watch those monuments destroyed within their own lifetimes shattered fundamental assumptions about wealth, legacy, and the ability to control the future. By 1935, the transformation was essentially complete. Fifth Avenue below 59th Street had become almost entirely commercial. The great mansions were gone, replaced by department stores, office buildings, and hotels. The families had scattered to Park Avenue, to the suburbs, to other cities entirely. The street that had defined American wealth for half a century now belonged to a different class entirely. Not the owners of capital, but the managers of capital. Not the builders of fortunes, but the administrators of corporations. The titans had fallen. Their monuments had crumbled. And Fifth Avenue moved on without them, indifferent to their loss, focused only on the future. Legacy in ruins. What happens when the dream that defines a family becomes its greatest burden? The answer reveals itself in auction catalogs, estate sales, and the quiet dispersal of objects that once symbolized permanence. When the Vanderbilt mansion closed in 1926, the contents were sold over 12 days at the Anderson Galleries in Manhattan. Furniture that cost thousands now fetched hundreds. Art purchased for prestige sold at fractions of original value. The family's history reduced to lot numbers and hammer prices. But the financial loss was the least of it. The Vanderbilt children and grandchildren faced something worse: the end of meaning. For 3 generations, being a Vanderbilt meant something specific. It meant you lived on Fifth Avenue. It meant you commanded respect simply by existing. It meant your name opened doors, secured invitations, granted automatic membership in the highest circles of American society. When the mansions went, that meaning evaporated. A Vanderbilt in an apartment on Park Avenue was just another wealthy person. The architecture had not merely housed the family. It had defined them. The mansion was the physical manifestation of their importance. Without it, they were ordinary. This psychological crisis played out across all the great families. The Astors struggled with it, the Carnegies, the Fricks. They had built identities around permanence, and permanence proved temporary. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable for many. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married the Duke of Marlborough in a spectacular 1895 wedding at the Vanderbilt mansion, wrote about this in her memoirs. She described the mansion as a prison of expectations. Every room represented an obligation. Every object carried the weight of family history. When the house sold, she felt relief mixed with profound sadness. The burden had been lifted, but so had purpose. The younger generation responded differently. They rejected the old model entirely. Why maintain a 100-room mansion when a 10-room apartment offered modern comforts and freedom from crushing overhead? Why employ 40 servants when 10 could manage a smaller space more efficiently? Why compete in a game where the rules had changed beyond recognition? This generational shift accelerated the decline. The grandchildren of Gilded Age titans had no interest in preserving monuments to an era they never truly experienced. They were born into wealth but came of age during World War I and the 1920s, when values shifted dramatically. The old conspicuous consumption seemed vulgar, wasteful, even unpatriotic. The new ideal was sophisticated modernity, streamlined, efficient, forward-looking. The mansions became embarrassments rather than badges of honor. When asked about the family estate, a young Vanderbilt in 1930 would shrug and say it had been sold. No pride in the admission, no shame either, just acceptance of changed circumstances. The emotional attachment their grandparents felt toward these buildings simply did not exist in them. Meanwhile, the city itself forgot remarkably quickly. Within a decade of demolition, most New Yorkers could not recall what stood on a particular block before the current building. The mansions left almost no trace. No plaques marked their locations. No historical societies fought for their preservation. New York's collective memory proved astonishingly short, but some traces remained. Photographs preserved the grandeur, at least visually. Family albums held images of balls and parties, of rooms filled with guests, of architectural details that took years to create. These photographs took on new significance as the buildings themselves vanished. They became the only proof that this world had existed at all. The photographs reveal something the families themselves could not see while living in the mansions: the hollowness behind the facade. Every image shows perfect composition, perfect lighting, perfect arrangement. But they also show rigid formality, stiff poses, forced smiles. The people in these photographs do not look happy. They look burdened by the weight of performance, by the constant need to maintain appearances. The mansions demanded performance. Every day was a production. Staff had to be managed. Rooms had to be maintained. Visitors had to be impressed. There was no privacy, no relaxation, no escape from the role. The family members became actors in their own lives, playing parts written by previous generations, unable to step off stage even in their own homes. When that stage finally collapsed, when the mansion sold and the families scattered, many felt something unexpected: liberation. The crushing weight of legacy lifted. They could, for the first time in their lives, simply be themselves. Not Vanderbilts or Astors or Carnegies, just people. But liberation came with loss. Identity is built on continuity. When 3 generations have defined themselves through Fifth Avenue addresses, what happens when those addresses disappear? Who are you when the thing that made you special vanishes? Some never recovered. They drifted through life, untethered from the anchors that once gave them direction. Others rebuilt their identities around new pursuits: business, art, philanthropy, public service. They found meaning beyond inherited wealth, discovering talents and passions that had been suppressed by the demands of maintaining the family mansion. The tragedy was not that the mansions fell. Buildings are just buildings. The tragedy was that an entire way of life vanished, taking with it certainties about class, status, and the permanence of wealth. The Gilded Age families believed they had built dynasties that would last forever. Instead, they built monuments to capitalism's creative destruction, temples to the very forces that would eventually destroy them. Their legacy exists in fragments: a fireplace in a Connecticut estate, a chandelier in a museum, photographs in archives, and questions that still resonate. What is the cost of ambition? How long can any fortune last? Can wealth ever truly protect against change? The mansions are gone, but these questions remain, as relevant today as they were a century ago. The rise of the new wealth. As the mansions fell, a new kind of wealth rose, one that didn't need the gilded walls to prove its power. The transformation happened quickly once it started. By 1928, Fifth Avenue's commercial corridor generated more revenue in a single year than the residential mansions had generated in their entire existence. Saks Fifth Avenue alone reported sales of $20 million annually. Tiffany & Company moved to 57th Street, occupying a building where the Vanderbilt mansion once stood, and watched profits soar. The new wealth was corporate, impersonal, and vastly more efficient than the old. The difference was fundamental. The Gilded Age fortunes were personal empires. Cornelius Vanderbilt owned the railroads. Andrew Carnegie owned the steel mills. John D. Rockefeller owned the oil refineries. Their wealth was tied directly to their names, their decisions, their personal control. When they died, the empire fragmented because it was built around individuals. The new wealth worked differently. Corporations owned the assets. Shareholders owned the corporations. Management ran the operations. The system created distance between wealth and personality. John Smith might serve as president of Saks Fifth Avenue, but he did not own it. He managed it on behalf of shareholders who themselves might be dispersed across hundreds or thousands of individuals. When Smith retired, someone else stepped in. The company continued unchanged. This corporate structure solved the succession problem that destroyed the Gilded Age families. The Vanderbilt fortune split among 8 children, then split again among dozens of grandchildren, until no individual commanded enough capital to maintain the lifestyle. But a corporation like Saks never split. It simply issued more shares. New investors could buy in. Old investors could sell out. The entity persisted regardless of individual fortunes. The tax advantages further accelerated the shift. Corporate profits were taxed at lower rates than individual income. Corporations could deduct expenses that individuals could not. A company that owned its headquarters faced different tax treatment than a family that owned its mansion. The law, often unwittingly, favored corporate wealth over personal wealth. And the corporations did not waste money on ostentation. They built functional buildings, not monuments. The Saks Fifth Avenue building was elegant, certainly, but every square foot generated revenue. There were no ballrooms, no art galleries, no rooms that existed purely for show. Everything served a commercial purpose. This efficiency allowed profit margins the old families could never achieve. The people who ran these corporations came from different backgrounds than the Gilded Age elite. They were professional managers, often rising from middle-class origins, educated in business schools rather than inheriting fortunes. They understood finance, marketing, operations. They ran their companies with data and analysis rather than personal whim. But they were also extraordinarily wealthy. A successful corporate executive in 1930 could earn $200,000 per year in salary and bonuses. That was less than a Vanderbilt's income, but the executive had none of the overhead. No mansion to maintain, no staff to pay, no crushing property taxes. A smart executive could save half their income, invest it wisely, and retire wealthy within 20 years. The investment opportunities also multiplied. The stock market, once primarily a vehicle for railroad and industrial stocks, now offered shares in retailers, real estate companies, banks, insurance firms, even the new automobile manufacturers. Diversification became possible in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. A prudent investor could spread risk across dozens of companies, protecting against the collapse of any single enterprise. Real estate itself transformed from a wealth storage vehicle into an income-generating asset. The old model was simple: buy land, build a mansion, live there. The new model was more complex, but far more profitable. Buy land, build an office or retail building, lease space, collect rent, refinance against the property's value, buy more land, repeat. A single investor could control $10 million worth of property with only $2 million in actual capital, using leverage to multiply returns. The mathematics of this new wealth creation were elegant. A building costing $1 million to construct might generate $150,000 in annual rent. After expenses and taxes, the owner cleared $75,000 in profit. That represented a 7.5% return on the initial investment. But if the owner had financed 60% of the construction cost with borrowed money, their actual investment was only $400,000. The $75,000 profit on $400,000 investment represented an 18.7% return. The leverage multiplied returns while spreading risk. These techniques were available to the Gilded Age families, but they rarely used them. They saw real estate as a place to live, not a business to manage. They hired agents to collect rents from tenement buildings they owned, but they did not aggressively develop and leverage property. That was seen as crass, commercial, beneath the dignity of old money. By the time they recognized their mistake, new players had already captured the market. The new billionaires emerged from this transformed landscape. Joseph Kennedy made a fortune in real estate and stock speculation. The Rockefeller family, unusually savvy among the old elite, shifted from oil into real estate development, building Rockefeller Center in the 1930s and demonstrating how to preserve dynastic wealth through corporate structures and professional management. The Pritzker family built a hotel empire using corporate entities that allowed them to expand without risking personal wealth. These families learned from the Vanderbilt collapse. They saw what happened when fortunes fragmented across generations. They structured their wealth differently, using trusts, foundations, and corporations to maintain control across multiple generations. They avoided the trap of tying their identity to physical structures. A hotel could be sold without shame. An office building could be demolished without family crisis. The wealth was portable, flexible, and resilient in ways that Fifth Avenue mansions never were. By 1940, the transition was complete. The old wealth was gone or absorbed into the new structures. The Fifth Avenue mansions that remained were owned by institutions, not families. The street had become the commercial spine of New York, lined with stores and offices that generated wealth rather than consumed it. The age of personal monuments had ended. The age of corporate efficiency had begun. And yet, something was lost. The new wealth created more money for more people. It was democratic in a way the old system never was. But it was also cold, impersonal, designed for profit rather than posterity. The Vanderbilt mansion was excessive, wasteful, and ultimately unsustainable. But it was also beautiful. It represented human ambition at its most grand. The office buildings that replaced it were practical and profitable, but no one would ever stand before them and feel wonder. The question the new billionaires faced was simple. Could they avoid the fate of the Vanderbilts while preserving something worth preserving? Or would efficiency always triumph over elegance, profit over legacy, the future over the past? Fifth Avenue reinvented. Fifth Avenue had been reborn, but what was left of the past? The physical transformation was total. By 1950, a visitor to Fifth Avenue would struggle to find any trace of the residential paradise that existed 60 years earlier. The William Waldorf Astor Mansion site now held a department store. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion became a commercial tower. The A.T. Stewart Mansion, the first of the great Fifth Avenue palaces, was demolished in 1901 to make way for retail space. Block by block, the old gave way to the new. The architecture of replacement buildings reflected changing values. Where the mansions had been ornate, the new structures were sleek. Where stone had been carved with intricate detail, glass and steel now rose in clean lines. Art Deco replaced Beaux-Arts. Functionality replaced ornamentation. The buildings were designed to maximize rentable square footage, not to impress neighbors or host balls, but the street retained its prestige, just in a different form. Fifth Avenue became synonymous with luxury retail. To have an address on Fifth Avenue meant your store or office occupied the most expensive real estate in America. Rents reached $50 per square foot annually by 1940, a staggering sum when average office space in New York leased for $5 per square foot. The street commanded premium prices because it delivered premium exposure. The retailers understood something the mansion owners had missed. Location creates value, but only if that value can be captured. A mansion generates no income. A store generates income every day. The same piece of land that produced nothing for a Vanderbilt could produce hundreds of thousands in profit for Saks or Tiffany. The land was the same. The use had changed, and that change unlocked wealth that dwarfed the Gilded Age fortunes. Consider the numbers. The block where the Vanderbilt mansion stood generated approximately $0 in economic activity when used as a private residence. The same block, redeveloped as retail space, generated roughly $5 million in annual sales by 1950. Assuming a 10% profit margin, that was $500,000 in profit. The taxes on that profit went to the city. The jobs created by the stores supported families. The products sold satisfied customer demand. The economic multiplier effect was enormous. From a utilitarian perspective, the transformation was entirely positive. More people benefited from the land's commercial use than ever benefited from its residential use. The 1,200 guests who might attend a Vanderbilt ball once or twice a year were replaced by tens of thousands of shoppers who visited daily. The 40 servants who maintained the mansion were replaced by hundreds of retail employees. The wealth created was distributed more broadly. Yet something irreplaceable was lost. The mansions represented a particular vision of American ambition. They were excessive, certainly, wasteful by modern standards, but they were also expressions of individual will at a scale rarely attempted before or since. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II commissioned a 137-room mansion, he was not thinking about economic efficiency. He was thinking about legacy, about creating something that would outlast him, about leaving a mark on the physical landscape that would endure for generations. The commercial buildings that replaced the mansions were designed to last 30 to 50 years before being torn down and replaced by something more modern. They were temporary by intent, built for the current market, ready to be discarded when conditions changed. The mansions were built to last forever. That they did not was a failure of vision, but the vision itself had grandeur. The cultural loss extended beyond architecture. The mansions had been stages for a particular kind of American culture. The balls, the dinners, the careful rituals of social life. These created shared experiences that bound the elite together. The culture was exclusive and often cruel. It valued birth over merit. But it was also sophisticated in ways that commercial culture could never replicate. A department store might host a fashion show, but it was fundamentally a commercial transaction. The guests attended to see products they might buy. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 had no commercial purpose. It was pure theater, created for its own sake, funded by private wealth used for public spectacle. When that culture disappeared, American social life became more democratic, but also more transactional. Everything had a price. Nothing was done purely for beauty or tradition or the sake of the thing itself. The few mansions that survived did so by transforming their purpose. The Frick Mansion became a museum, no longer a home, but a public institution. The Andrew Carnegie Mansion on 91st Street became the Cooper Hewitt Museum. The Henry Clay Frick Mansion was designated a landmark. These preservations were important, but they also confirmed the fundamental shift. The buildings could only survive by ceasing to be homes and becoming something else entirely. The families themselves adapted with varying success. Some Vanderbilt descendants became successful business people, shedding the old identity and building new fortunes through their own efforts. Others clung to the name while watching their inheritances dwindle, trading on past glory while contributing nothing new. The Astor family similarly divided. Some thrived by embracing the modern world, others withered by rejecting it. The lessons were clear, though not always learned. Wealth required active management, not passive inheritance. Buildings were liabilities unless they generated income. Legacy could be preserved through institutions and endowments, not through private monuments. The families that understood these principles survived. Those that did not disappeared into comfortable obscurity. By the time Fifth Avenue's transformation was complete, New York had become a fundamentally different city. The residential enclaves had moved north to Park Avenue and east to the suburbs. The commercial core had expanded to consume neighborhoods that were once sacrosanct. The city prioritized growth and efficiency over preservation and tradition. This was progress by most measures. But it was also a kind of forgetting. Today, tourists walk past the sites where the great mansions once stood and have no idea what came before. The plaques are few. The photographs are archived. The physical remnants have been scattered to antique stores and museum collections. Fifth Avenue's Gilded Age exists only in books and memories, a ghost of prosperity haunting a street that has moved on without looking back. But the ghost has lessons to teach about the impermanence of wealth, about the costs of maintaining legacy, about the inevitability of change. The mansions fell because their owners believed they could freeze time, could create permanence through architecture and fortune. They learned too late that nothing is permanent, not wealth, not buildings, not even the street itself. Everything changes, everything ends. The only question is whether we learn from the ending or repeat the same mistakes again. The cost of dreams. Fifth Avenue's mansions were monuments to ambition, but in the end, their true cost was far more than monetary. The financial cost was staggering. The Vanderbilt family spent over $15 million building and maintaining their various Fifth Avenue properties. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $450 million in today's currency. A fortune spent on buildings that stood for less than 50 years. The return on that investment was negative, spectacularly, catastrophically negative, but the financial loss pales beside the human cost. 3 generations of Vanderbilts defined themselves through Fifth Avenue addresses. They built their identities around physical structures and social positions that proved temporary. When those structures were demolished, when those positions evaporated, many found themselves adrift. The psychology of loss is complex. Losing something you earned through your own effort is painful but comprehensible. You understand the connection between action and outcome, but losing something you inherited, something you were taught to see as permanent, something that defined your family for generations, that creates a different kind of pain. It feels like betrayal, as if the universe broke a promise. The Vanderbilt descendants who lived through the demolition of the family mansions described it in those terms. They felt betrayed by the city that allowed commercial development, by the previous generation that had not prepared them for change, by capitalism itself, which rewarded efficiency over tradition. But most of all, they felt betrayed by their own assumptions about permanence. The emotional cost extended to the servants as well. A butler who spent 30 years in the Vanderbilt mansion did not just lose a job. He lost an identity. He was the Vanderbilt butler. That meant something. It commanded respect in certain circles. It represented a life of service to greatness. When the mansion closed, that identity evaporated. He became just another unemployed servant in a city that had less and less use for domestic staff. The social cost rippled through New York's elite. The demolition of the great mansions destroyed the physical infrastructure of high society. The balls could not be held without ballrooms. The dinners could not be hosted without grand dining rooms. The careful rituals of social competition required stages, and those stages were being torn down. Some adapted by moving to hotels. The Waldorf Astoria and Plaza Hotel both featured grand ballrooms available for private events. But hosting a party in a hotel was fundamentally different from hosting one in your home. It was commercial, impersonal. The guests knew the space was rented, temporary. The magic was diminished. Others simply stopped entertaining on the grand scale. They hosted smaller dinners in apartments or suburban homes. The intimacy was sometimes welcomed, a relief from the exhausting performance of Gilded Age society. But it also represented defeat, an admission that the old ways could not be sustained, that the families who once commanded New York society could no longer afford to maintain their positions. The cultural cost was perhaps the greatest. The Fifth Avenue mansions represented a particular moment in American history when private wealth could create public beauty. The buildings were private, certainly, but their facades contributed to the streetscape. Their gardens were visible from sidewalks. Their architectural details enriched the urban environment for everyone, not just their owners. When they were demolished and replaced with purely commercial structures, that public contribution disappeared. The new buildings were designed to maximize profit, not to beautify the street. They had their own aesthetic, sleek and modern, but it was not meant to inspire wonder. It was meant to facilitate transactions. This shift from beauty as an end in itself to beauty as a marketing tool represented a fundamental change in values. The Gilded Age, for all its flaws, believed that wealthy people had obligations beyond profit. They should patronize the arts, build beautiful buildings, create spaces that would inspire future generations. The new corporate wealth had no such illusions. Beauty was valuable only if it increased revenue. The personal cost to individual family members varied wildly. Some, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, found liberation in the collapse of the old system. Others, like Cornelius Vanderbilt III, found only despair. The difference often came down to whether they had developed identities beyond their inherited wealth. Those who had careers, passions, purposes independent of the family fortune adapted successfully. Those whose entire sense of self depended on being a Fifth Avenue Vanderbilt simply could not adjust. The lesson here is brutal, but clear. Basing your identity on external circumstances, especially circumstances you do not control, is a recipe for psychological destruction. The mansions were always temporary, even though they seemed permanent. The fortunes were always vulnerable, even though they seemed secure. The social positions were always contingent, even though they seemed fixed. Understanding this impermanence is essential to emotional survival. But that understanding came too late for many. They had been raised to believe in permanence, taught that the family mansion would always be there, that the fortune would always provide, that their social position was guaranteed. When those certainties crumbled, they had no psychological framework for processing the loss. Some turned to alcohol, others to drugs, a few to suicide. The statistics are incomplete, but the evidence suggests abnormally high rates of depression and substance abuse among Gilded Age descendants in the 1920s and 30s. The cost of dreams, it turns out, is measured not just in dollars, but in shattered assumptions, lost identities, and the painful realization that nothing, gold, can stay. The Fifth Avenue mansions were built to last forever. They lasted barely a generation, and in their fall, they taught a lesson about ambition, legacy, and the fundamental impermanence of all human achievement. It was an expensive lesson. The tuition was paid in demolition, dispersal, and despair. Whether anyone learned from it remains an open question. What was lost? In the wreckage of New York's Gilded Age, what was lost is more than just bricks and mortar. It was a piece of America's soul. The physical loss can be quantified. Approximately $100 million worth of construction, in period terms, was demolished along Fifth Avenue between 1900 and 1950. That is $3 billion in today's currency, reduced to rubble and dumped in landfills or used as fill for construction projects around the city. The marble, the carved wood, the stained glass, the architectural details that took master craftsmen years to create, all destroyed in weeks. But numbers cannot capture what was truly lost. The Fifth Avenue mansions represented a particular vision of what America could be. The men who built them believed that individual achievement could create lasting monuments. They believed that private wealth could serve public good through architectural beauty. They believed that ambition, channeled through capitalism, could build dynasties that would shape American culture for generations. They were wrong about the permanence, but the vision itself had power. It inspired architecture of astonishing quality. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible in residential construction. It created jobs for thousands of craftsmen, laborers, and servants. It generated a cultural infrastructure that supported artists, musicians, and writers. The balls and dinners hosted in these mansions were not just social events. They were cultural engines that drove fashion, taste, and artistic patronage. When the mansions fell, that cultural engine stopped. The patronage dispersed. The artists and musicians who depended on wealthy sponsors found themselves competing in an open market where commercial viability mattered more than quality. Some thrived in the new environment, many did not. The result was a flattening of culture, a movement toward mass appeal and away from the specialized, refined art that wealthy patrons had supported. This was not entirely negative. The democratization of culture allowed new voices to emerge. Artists from working-class backgrounds could now reach audiences without needing aristocratic approval. Jazz, blues, and other forms of popular music flourished precisely because they bypassed the old gatekeepers. But something was lost in the transition. The economic support for art that had no commercial appeal, that existed purely for aesthetic or intellectual reasons. The loss extended to craftsmanship as well. The Fifth Avenue mansions employed the finest artisans in the world, stone carvers from Italy, wood workers from Germany, painters from France. These craftsmen trained apprentices who would carry on their skills. But when the demand for their work dried up, the training stopped. The skills were not passed on. Within a generation, certain techniques were simply lost. No one alive today knows how to do some of the decorative work visible in photographs of the Vanderbilt mansions. The knowledge died with the craftsmen. The social loss was equally profound. For all its exclusivity and snobbery, Gilded Age society provided structure and meaning for those within it. The rules were clear. The expectations were defined. Success or failure could be measured against objective standards. This clarity gave people purpose, even if that purpose was often shallow. When the system collapsed, it was not replaced by something equally structured. Modern social life is more fluid, more democratic, more open, but it is also more ambiguous. Success is harder to define. Status is more contested. The clarity of the old system, for all its faults, at least provided certainty. The new system offers freedom, but demands that individuals create their own meaning. Not everyone is equipped for that challenge. The environmental loss is harder to see, but equally real. The Fifth Avenue mansions, despite their excess, were built to last. They used thick stone walls, slate roofs, hardwood floors, materials that would have survived for centuries with minimal maintenance. The buildings that replaced them were designed for obsolescence. Steel frames rust, glass cracks, mechanical systems fail. A commercial building from the 1930s is now approaching the end of its useful life. The mansion it replaced would still be structurally sound. This shift toward disposable architecture has environmental costs we are only now beginning to understand. The energy required to demolish and rebuild every 50 years far exceeds the energy needed to maintain a structure built for permanence. The waste generated is enormous. The Fifth Avenue mansions were, unintentionally, more sustainable than the buildings that replaced them. But perhaps the greatest loss is psychological. The Gilded Age believed in greatness. It believed that individuals could achieve extraordinary things, that ambition was noble, that leaving a mark on the world was a worthy goal. This belief drove the construction of the Fifth Avenue mansions. It also drove the creation of libraries, museums, universities, and other institutions that still serve the public today. The modern era is more skeptical. We distrust grand ambitions. We question the motives of the wealthy. We assume that extreme success comes from exploitation rather than innovation. Some of this skepticism is warranted. The Gilded Age industrialists were often ruthless, but the wholesale rejection of their belief in greatness has costs too. It makes us smaller, more cautious, less willing to attempt difficult things. The Fifth Avenue mansions failed. They were unsustainable. impractical, and ultimately demolished. But they were also magnificent. They represented human ambition at its most grand. And their loss removed from the landscape a certain kind of inspiration. The inspiration that comes from seeing what is possible when resources are unlimited and vision is unconstrained. Walk down Fifth Avenue today and you will see stores, offices, hotels, all useful, all generating economic value. But you will not see anything that makes you stop and wonder. Nothing that challenges your sense of what humans can achieve. Nothing that inspires you to dream bigger dreams. That capacity to inspire, that was what was truly lost when the mansions fell. And it is a loss we still feel, even if we cannot quite name it. A new generation, a new lesson. The story of Fifth Avenue's transformation is more than just history. It's a cautionary tale for today's billionaires. The parallels between the Gilded Age and our own era are impossible to ignore. Once again, America has created a class of ultra-wealthy individuals whose fortunes dwarf those of previous generations. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, these men command wealth that makes the Vanderbilts look modest by comparison. Once again, that wealth is being invested in grand projects, private space companies, mega yachts, massive estates in exclusive locations. The question is whether these modern billionaires have learned from Fifth Avenue's fall. The early evidence is mixed. Some clearly understand the lesson. Warren Buffett lives in the same modest house he bought in 1958. He has pledged to give away 99% of his wealth. He avoids the trap of tying his identity to physical monuments. His legacy will be measured in the institutions and endowments he creates, not in buildings bearing his name. Others seem determined to repeat the same mistakes. Tech billionaires build compounds in Silicon Valley that cost hundreds of millions but generate no income. Hedge fund managers construct estates in the Hamptons that require staffs of dozens to maintain. The scale is different, but the fundamental dynamic is the same: wealth converted into consumption rather than productive assets. The tax environment has changed, offering both challenges and opportunities. Modern estate taxes are lower than their Gilded Age equivalents, but income taxes remain high. Capital gains treatment favors investment over earned income. The tax code, intentionally or not, guides the wealthy toward particular kinds of wealth preservation strategies. Those who understand these rules can structure their fortunes to last. Those who do not will watch their wealth fragment across generations, just like the Vanderbilts. The rise of charitable foundations represents one adaptation to the Fifth Avenue lesson. Bill and Melinda Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and others have moved substantial portions of their wealth into foundations that will outlive them. These institutions allow the wealthy to maintain influence and legacy without the crushing overhead of personal monuments. A foundation can exist forever, funding causes the donor cares about, without requiring anyone to maintain a 100-room mansion. But foundations have their own problems. They can become disconnected from their original purpose. They can be captured by professional managers who serve their own interests rather than the donor's intent. They can ossify, continuing to fund outdated approaches long after circumstances have changed. The Carnegie Corporation and Rockefeller Foundation still exist, but they bear little resemblance to their founders' original visions. The technology sector has also created new mechanisms for legacy preservation. Stock in a successful company can maintain value across multiple generations if properly managed. The Walton family, heirs to Walmart founder Sam Walton, have maintained their fortune by retaining stock and staying involved in company governance. This approach avoids the fragmentation that destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune, but it requires active management and family cohesion. A single generation that decides to cash out, to sell stock, and spend rather than hold and manage can destroy what previous generations built. The temptation is always present. Why maintain the burden of stewardship when you could simply sell and enjoy the money? The real estate market offers another lesson. Modern billionaires who invest in property increasingly favor income-generating assets over personal residences. They buy apartment buildings, office towers, retail centers, properties that produce revenue. Even their personal estates are sometimes designed with eventual conversion in mind. A mega mansion in the Hamptons might be built to become a hotel or conference center after the owner's death. This thinking was absent in the Gilded Age, when personal use was seen as incompatible with commercial purpose. The cultural shift is perhaps most significant. Modern wealth increasingly accepts impermanence. A tech billionaire knows their company might be obsolete in 20 years. A hedge fund manager knows markets change. The expectation of permanent dominance that characterized the Gilded Age has been replaced by a more realistic understanding of economic cycles and competitive threats. This psychological adjustment makes the wealthy more willing to diversify, more cautious about overextension, more strategic about legacy planning. But the fundamental challenge remains: what is wealth for? If the purpose is simply to accumulate and preserve, then the optimal strategy is clear. Invest conservatively, diversify broadly, minimize overhead, use trusts and foundations to prevent fragmentation. But if the purpose is to make a mark, to create something meaningful, to leave the world different than you found it, then pure preservation is insufficient. The Fifth Avenue mansions represented an attempt to do both, to preserve wealth and create meaning. They failed at preservation, but succeeded, at least temporarily, at creating meaning. The buildings inspired awe. The parties set cultural trends. The families shaped American society. For a brief moment, private wealth created public beauty and cultural leadership. Can modern billionaires achieve both goals more successfully? Can they preserve their fortunes across generations while also creating institutions, endowments, or innovations that outlast them? The answer depends on whether they learn from Fifth Avenue's lesson. Buildings are temporary, institutions can be eternal. Personal monuments crumble, but ideas endure. Wealth used for pure consumption disappears, but wealth invested in productive assets or charitable purposes can compound indefinitely. The story of Fifth Avenue's fall is ultimately a story about the relationship between wealth and time. The Vanderbilts thought they had conquered time, that their fortunes and mansions would last forever. They were wrong. Time conquered them instead. Their mansions fell, their fortunes dispersed, their dynasty ended, but their story survives. It teaches us that no achievement is permanent, that no fortune is secure, that change is the only constant. It reminds us that what seems solid can dissolve, that what appears permanent can vanish, that hubris is always punished by reality. The modern billionaires standing at their own peaks would do well to look back at Fifth Avenue in its glory days, to see the magnificent mansions, the brilliant balls, the families at the height of their power, and then to look again at Fifth Avenue today, where none of that remains, where commercial buildings stand on ground once sacred to family dynasties, where the Vanderbilt name survives only as a university, an insurance company, and a historical footnote. That transformation happened in less than 50 years, a single lifetime, from peak to erasure in the span of one generation. It can happen again. It will happen again. The only questions are, who will it happen to, and will they see it coming? The answer to the second question depends on whether they remember the first lesson of capitalism. Creative destruction spares no one. The mansions fell because the forces that built them eventually turned against them. The same will be true for today's billionaires. The technology that made them rich will eventually make them obsolete. The question is whether they prepare for that obsolescence or pretend it will never come. Fifth Avenue offers the answer. Pretending leads to ruin. Accepting leads to adaptation. The mansions that became museums survived. Those that remained private residences were demolished. The wealth that transformed into foundations and institutions endured. That which remained purely personal disappeared. The lesson is clear. The application is difficult, but the stakes could not be higher. For in the end, every fortune faces the same choice: evolve or vanish, adapt or be destroyed, accept impermanence or be crushed by the weight of impossible dreams. Fifth Avenue chose wrong. History gave them a chance to learn. Will the present generation be wiser? Only time will tell. And time, as Fifth Avenue learned, is the ultimate judge, patient, impartial, and absolutely unforgiving.